As we said, the IRS is very interested in employee status because it's charged with enforcement of the law requiring withholding of taxes. You only have to do that for employees. So the IRS wants to make sure that you are withholding if in fact it is an employee. Now the IRS test used to use 20 different factors, and I'll include a document online, you can find it, indicating what those 20 factors were. But of course the problem with using 20 different factors to answer the question of employee status meant that it was hard to determine, because in a case of 20 factors, if 13 of them point one way and 7 of them point the other way, is that the way you go with the majority? So the IRS originally had this 20-factor test. They simplified that, however, into a 3-factor test. Essentially what they did is they took the 20 factors and grouped them into 3 categories. And so now we're looking at 3 different factors in order to determine whether someone is an employee or not. And the first factor is behavioral control. And as we talked about in the right of control test, behavioral control relates to, can I control the behavior of this worker? Can I make them clean the floors in a particular order? Or can I make them stop and pick up fares? Or can I make them drive a certain route map in making their deliveries? So behavioral control is similar to that right of control that we talked about in the common law agency test. There is a twist, however. They've also added financial control. Can the employer exercise financial control over the worker? There was another taxi case, and in this taxi case, determining whether they were employees or independent contractors, it turned out that the employer, the taxi company, would lease a taxi to the driver and then would take payments from that out of the fares of the driver. And the way it worked then was that essentially the financial control, the driver's finances, were in the hands of the company. That the company was leasing them this vehicle, but then taking lease payments out automatically from the amount they made as taxi drivers. And so that looked like financial control. And financial control, again, is indicative of employee status. Can you control the finances of this person? And finally, the type of relationship. What historically has been the relationship between this type of employer and this type of worker? If it looks like a traditional employment status, then that's going to look like the worker is an employee. So what is the type of relationship between the two? Now the IRS can charge huge fines for employers who fail to withhold taxes. In essence, what they do is, first of all, make you pay all the amounts that you should have withheld but did not. They don't go after the individual workers for those, they go after the employer. And then on top of that, there's a fine, and on top of that, there may be additional expenses. So employee misclassification for tax purposes is especially problematic for employers. Now, the IRS created what they call the Voluntary Compliance Settlement Program, in which they said that, in essence, if an employer is unsure if its workers are employees or independent contractors, then that employer could ask the IRS. They could say, IRS, take a look at these factors and tell us, are they employees or not? Unfortunately, that hasn't had a lot of success, because what the IRS says is that you can only do this if they've never been classified as employees. And there is if the IRS finds that they're employees, you must reclassify them. You don't get a second bite at the apple. And so employers are reluctant to submit these things to the IRS because the IRS has an incentive to find employee status. And so, therefore, for an employer, you may not want to notify the IRS of this particular type of position.